T-34 tank, a World War II armored legend. 1937 to 1943. A pack crew spots an approaching Soviet tank. The experienced gunners know exactly what to do once they've located the enemy tank. They work out the range and align their sights onto the tank, and then load a 37mm shell into the gun's breech. The commander gives the signal, and the gunner opens fire. The shell flies out of the barrel and hits the moving tank. When the smoke clears, they can see that nothing has happened, and the Soviet tank is still advancing towards them. The pack crew can't understand why the tank hasn't been destroyed, so they load and fire another round, but once again it just bounces off the enemy tank. The crew are beginning to get concerned and look at each other in bewilderment. Another round is fired, and then another, but the tank continues to move forward and is now getting very close to them. The pack crew starts to panic and abandon their gun as they run away in terror to escape being crushed beneath the tank's tracks. A green steel monster grinds itself over the pack anti-tank gun, crushing it beneath its tracks, and moves on, unimpeded and simply unstoppable. It was June 1941. Operation Barbarossa was in full swing, yet the Wehrmacht was facing an unknown enemy tank, one completely different from all the others. It was the T-34, a new generation of Soviet medium tank, one that would face a difficult start, but would carry on to become an absolute legend among tanks. In the summer of 1936, civil war broke out in Spain between the Republicans and the Nationalists. The Soviet Union was supporting the Republicans against the Nationalists, who were receiving support from Italy and Nazi Germany. In October 1936, a contingent of some 50 Soviet tanks arrived in Spain. The first tank battle took place on October 29th between the Soviet-made T-26 tanks and the Italian CV-35 tankettes. The Soviet tanks had a clear advantage with their armor, main guns, and mobility. Their 45mm 20K gun was designed as an anti-tank gun, modified for tank use, facing the 8mm machine guns of the Italian CV-35 tankettes. The outcome was to be expected. The T-26 dominated the battlefield. Even the reinforcements that Nazi Germany sent in the form of Panzer I tanks were not sufficient enough to oppose these new tanks. The Soviet tanks clearly had the advantage in terms of firepower and were able to knock out every tank that the enemy put into the field against them. The first reports sent back to the USSR by the Soviet military personnel and advisors were overall positive. Even with the inexperienced crews and lack of infantry support and coordination, the Soviet tanks managed to turn the tide and help defend Madrid. However, things started to turn bad for the T-26 and later on the BT-5 tanks. The prime weapons that they were facing were no longer the enemy tanks, but anti-tank guns. Nazi Germany was utilizing their most up-to-date anti-tank gun, the 37mm Pak-36. Reports sent back were becoming more and more alarming. Huge losses were taken, where even a couple of Paks were now enough to stop an entire tank platoon. Something had to be done to rectify the problem. In the 1930s, the Red Army had a massive fleet of tanks, consisting mainly of T-26 and BT series. These tanks were inadequate in terms of armor, reliability, engine power, and parts maintenance. The Winter War and Battle of Khasan Lake, and later Khalkhin Gol, demonstrated all the weaknesses of the Soviet tank fleet: the thin armor, bad maneuverability, gasoline engines that were prone to catch fire when hit, and inadequate firepower. It can be difficult to keep up with new technology and ideas, and to just rely on and try and improve the old designs. One of these was a convertible drive. The concept was fairly simple. The tanks would use wheels like a regular motor vehicle when traveling on the road. The crew would mount the tracks when approaching the battlefield to gain better cross-country deployment. After the battle was over, the tracks could be removed, and the tank would become a wheeled vehicle again. In 1937 to 1938, the Kharkov factory number 183 was designing a new tank, designated the A-20. Engineers used a typical approach by taking a well-proven tank as a base and improving it. The tank they used was the BT-7. They redesigned the turret, the armor plate, profiles, and angles. widened the tracks, and redesigned the road wheels. Thus, the tank they created had less in common with the BT series and became a foundation for the new line of tanks. By angling the armor plates, the designers achieved far superior protection. The sloped armor concept was not new, but had barely been used up to that point. The chief engineer, Mikhail Koshkin, was not totally satisfied with the results and of the whole concept of a convertible drive. On his initiative, another project went into the design stage, the A32. The main differences with the A20 was the removal of the whole mechanism for the convertible drive, increasing the armor protection to 30 millimeters and thus increasing the overall size. This in turn required another road wheel on each side, but allowed for the installation of a much stronger and larger cannon. Instead of the 45mm, the A32 would hold a 76.2mm L11 gun. The future of the T-34 was taking shape. The gamble paid off. During the state trials at Kubinka, the A32 outperformed the A20 project, partially due to the change and shift in thinking by the state leaders and decision-makers. They would shift from the convertible drive idea to the increased armor protection and firepower. As it turns out, state trials would take place in September 1939, the same month as the Wehrmacht would cross the Polish border and initiate World War II. This fact would also accelerate work on the tanks and the need to have them as soon as possible. The A32 tank was officially designated the T-32. Even though the tank had passed state trials, the State Commission had requested some changes to be implemented in December 1939, namely to strengthen the armor to 45mm, to implement the cheaper and simpler F-32 cannon, increase the number of machine guns, make visibility better and strengthen the tank parts. Upon planned implementation of improvements, the tank was to be renamed the T-34. In January 1940, a new A-34 tank was ready for trials. The second model was assembled in the next month. Tests were vigorous and extreme. Many defects, problems, and general shortcomings were detected. Things like poor visibility due to glass fogging, bad ammunition racks, and the short lifespan of the V2 engine were sufficient enough reasons to delay production of the tank. Without waiting to correct all noted shortcomings, a tank race was organized in strict secrecy. A 750-kilometer drive from Kharkov to Moscow took place with the aforementioned designer Koshkin driving one of the tanks. Unfortunately, the chief designer Mikhail Koshkin would pay with his life with the development of the tank, succumbing to a bout of pneumonia he received during the state trials. He drove the T-34 tank for hundreds of kilometers while feeling unwell from Kharkov to Moscow. He was to be replaced by Alexander Morozov. The race would end at Ivanovskaya Square in the middle of the night in the confines of the Kremlin walls. The next morning, the State Commission, including Stalin himself, made a final decision. The tank had performed very well and left a great impression. On March 31, 1940, the Defense Committee issued instructions calling for the mass production of the T-34 at the Kharkov factory. The legend was born, and the journey of refining and battle-proving the tank had begun. On June 22, 1941, Germany unleashed Operation Barbarossa. It was, to that day, the largest invasion force in history, fielding some 3.5 million men, 3,400 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft. 3 army groups were heading towards Leningrad, Smolensk, and the Ukraine, aiming to cripple the Soviet defenses and decimate the Red Army. The Red Army was unprepared for the attack. Nominally, it had some 23,000 tanks, an astonishing figure. However, most of these were old T-26 and BT series. The first engagements were terribly one-sided. German panzers were inflicting high casualties due to the better equipment, better organization of armored units, and more experienced crews. The Soviet troops lacked support, logistics, maintenance facilities, and most of their tanks were needing some kind of repair, either light or a complete overhaul. However, on June 23rd, the Wehrmacht would face down an unknown new threat. In shock and terror, their anti-tank crews and even panzer crews would face the T-34 tanks. They would fire their most powerful shells and score direct hits, but nothing would have an effect on the enemy tanks. Even at point-blank range, penetration was not guaranteed. The Red Army faced many problems. The lack of spare parts, fuel, and shells meant that many tanks did not even have armor-piercing rounds. They would pack what they had at the moment, high-explosive rounds and any fuel they could get their hands on, and ride into battle. Some would simply roll over German anti-tank guns. One gun was able to confront the T-34s, though, the potent flak 88mm anti-aircraft gun. It had sufficient penetration and power to knock out any of these Red Army tanks. Luckily for the Germans, the Soviet tactics were poor in those days. Poorly planned and coordinated attacks, no coordination of adjacent units, sending armor and vehicles piecemeal instead of as a formation, lack of training of the crews, and the Luftwaffe had total air superiority. Many T-34s were lost to the Stuttgart air attacks. They were circling the battlefields almost unopposed as the Soviet Air Force had been decimated. In just one day, it had lost between 1,200 and 2,000 aircraft, most of which were densely packed on airstrips and carpet-bombed or strafed by the Luftwaffe. The Soviet Air Force had lost many new aircraft like the Yak-1, MiG-3, and Lag-3s. Those losses will have terrible consequences for the Red Army in the following months. Thus, of some 1,000 T-34s that were available at the start of Operation Barbarossa, just a few had survived. Many were left out, damaged, abandoned, or surrendered on the battlefield. Crews couldn't fix the simplest of mechanical breakdowns. Some crews had only a few hours of experience driving the tanks. Some had only just seen a tank for the first time when the war had started. Even if some of them could have fixed those mechanical problems, there were no spare parts, no logistics available to them. The Luftwaffe had bombed and knocked out most of the warehouses and facilities in the western districts of the Soviet Union. To make matters worse, the entire Soviet production was focused on producing tanks, not the spare parts. Due to the quarrels and obstructions in the bureaucracy chain, not all the T-34s were issued with the newer F-34 gun. Some had to go with the older L-11 gun. The hot and dusty summer months were replaced by the autumn rains. German tankmen soon found out what the Russian word Rasputitsa meant, a total lack of decent roads and a whole ocean of mud. Tanks got stuck, losing tracks, and trucks and light vehicles were unable to move or keep up, making a total mayhem of the logistics. On the other hand, the T-34s fared far better. Their wide tracks were better suited for such conditions, making lower ground pressure and a powerful diesel engine provided enough cross-country mobility. However, the Soviet tank production was facing difficult times. Many factories were disassembled and sent to the east, to the Urals and Siberia. Those that were still working were trying their best to assemble as many tanks as possible and send them to the front. Until the end of the year, some 2,000 T-34s were produced. It was not nearly enough to reinforce the ranks, especially after the heavy losses around Kiev, Vyazma, and other pockets and encirclements. Operation Typhoon was launched by the Germans in October 1941. Their main goal was the destruction of the Soviet forces defending Moscow and the capture of the city itself. Panzer groups were spearheading the advance, breaking through battered and scattered Soviet troops. Colonel Mikhail Kotukov and his 4th Tank Brigade took positions near Tula, some 170 kilometers from Moscow. The brigade was newly formed, with some 22 T-34 tanks among various other types. Around Mtsensk, the German 2nd Panzer Army was advancing, but was in for a nasty surprise. Soviet infantry had lured the German tanks into the open. Suddenly, Soviet tanks appeared on the flanks from out of the forest, striking a heavy blow. Soviet tank ace Lubushkin destroyed 5 German tanks in this single battle. Another tank ace, Dmitry Lavrenenko, also scored a high kill count. The German command was surprised and shocked. A commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, General Heinz Guderian, was furious that the advance on Tula had halted and momentum was lost. His assessment of the situation was looking bleak. The Soviet tanks were showing their superiority in a very sharp form. Tactics of employment were always evolving and changing. A special commission was sent by the Germans in November 1941 to assess the Soviet medium and heavy tanks. The outcome of this was that they had to step up the development and introduction of the Panzer V Panther tank. Colonel Katukov paved the way for the new tank tactics. The T-34 tanks were dug in and heavily camouflaged. Dummy and fake positions were made. Tank crews were instructed to open fire only when a definite hit was guaranteed at around a distance of some 200 to 300 meters. The T-34s were able to knock out enemy tanks from over 1,000 meters, while the German tanks had to come in much closer to guarantee a hit. Thus, in 1941, the T-34 could dominate the battlefield. The T-34 would play a significant role in the subsequent Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow in December 1941. It became a common sight to see T-34s with their wide tracks, painted white and with a squad of soldiers riding on top of them, charging across at the German lines. The trend continued in 1942, but some dangerous adversaries started to appear in the German army. To counter the T-34 threat, a new German heavy tank was introduced, the Panzer VI Tiger. With its 88mm main gun and 100mm of frontal armor, it proved to be a worthy opponent. The T-34 had to use its advantage of speed and maneuverability to outsmart the Tiger tank. Other vehicles like the Panzer IV Ausf F2, Stug 3 Ausf F, Marder series, and the Pak-40 anti-tank cannon were a direct response to the threat of the Soviet tank. Compared to the old 50mm and short 75mm guns, these vehicles were all sporting longer-barreled 75mm cannons, making duels with T-34s more even. Soviet designers were trying to rectify the situation by improving the T-34 tank. The main demand of the Soviet High Command was for greater production numbers. Any change must not reflect heavily upon production figures. Thus, changes had to be implemented gradually and carefully. A Model 1942 had a number of technical improvements, some of which were designed to simplify the production process and cost. Namely, instead of welding, a cast turret was introduced, a new driver's hatch, new track design, a different transmission cover, and a completely new wheel design. Side armor was also increased to 45mm. One of the biggest tank factories was the Stalingrad Tractor Factory, responsible for the production of nearly half the T-34s. This huge factory was also simplifying the tank production process, creating the unique shapes and designs of the various parts required. A massive battle took place in the vicinity of Stalingrad and then in the city itself. New tanks were actually being assembled during the battle and even took part firing from the factory grounds onto the advancing German troops. It was a column of T-34 tanks that had crossed the bridge over the River Don near the town of Kalak between the 21st and 22nd of November 1942 that were effectively encircling the German troops in Stalingrad. In the first half of 1943, the T-34 had received yet another upgrade package. This model had a new hexagonal turret, which gave a bit more space for the two crew members inside it. New hatches, which, when open, gave a distinctive shape to the top of the tank. The Germans referred to it as the Mickey Mouse, as these hatches, when open, remind them of the Mickey Mouse cartoon character's ears. New round external fuel tanks were added, an armored hull machine gun mantlet, as well as handrails, which gave the infantry, tank riders, and crew something to hang on to when the tank was in motion. In the summer of 1943, the tank started to receive the commander's cupola on top of the turret, which gave a better all-around visibility to the tank commander. Thus, the T-34s, along with the other mass-produced Soviet tanks, were waiting for the next major offensive. In the summer of 1943, a huge tank battle would take place in the Kursk Bulge, showing the strengths and weaknesses of the tank design. It was here that the last German major offensive in the East would take place, and the critical point of the war. After the battle, the T-34 would roll west towards Germany and Berlin. The T-34 had shown a good balance of armor, firepower, and mobility. Its overall length was 6.68 meters, a width of 3 meters, and a height of 2.45 meters. Its weight was around 26 tons, almost twice as heavy as the BT series. However, unlike the BT series, the T-34 had a 76.2mm cannon, which outclassed the earlier 45mm guns with its penetration capabilities and firepower. Its armor protection was very high for that period during the war. Its frontal armor was 40 to 45mm thick for the hull, and 60 mm for the turret, and the side armor ranged from 40 to 52 mm. Compared to the BT-7, which only had some 6 to 13 mm thick armor, this was a huge advantage. It was just the additional depth of armor that made this tank so sturdy and strong. The use of sloped armor had now shown its full potential. For example, a nominal 45 mm thickness of the hull frontal armor, angled at 60 degrees, meant that the effective armor that a shell had to penetrate was 90 mm. This gave the T-34 a distinct advantage over the German tanks and anti-tank guns, with the greater distances that it could start engaging the enemy from. There were several techniques used in manufacturing the armored sections and joining them all together. Tank armor can be cast, welded, or bolted together. Bolting the sections together was a technique used in the interwar period that had shown its failings during the early stages of World War II. Bolted armor tended to crack and send bolts and shrapnel flying around when hit. The T-34's initial production had used cast armor. The unusual thing was the tank's frontal plate. It was a large metal piece bent into shape using a massive press. This would later be abandoned, and welding and bolting was used instead to simplify the process and make the armor stronger. Later on, a different practice was used. Two plates were joined by a 100 mm thick girder, being welded and bolted together. However, there were differences between the factories that they were built in. For instance, tanks from the Stalingrad tractor factory had front glacis plate and rear armor interleaved with the side plates. The gun tube recuperator cover was also simplified, creating a kind of chisel-like shape. There were two main guns used in the production of early T-34 tanks. The first one, the L-11, was a huge leap forward compared to the earlier 45 mm guns from the T-26 and BT series. However, it had suffered from malfunctions, lower shell velocity, and a complicated design. A simpler yet more effective design, the F-34 cannon, was used later on. It had better ballistics, it was easier to produce, and remained the main gun until the introduction of the D5 and S-53 85 mm guns, used on the T-34 through 85. It could penetrate 92 mm of vertical armored plate at a distance of 500 meters, which made it a formidable opponent to any enemy tank that encountered it in 1941. The Soviet Army had conducted tests on earlier captured German tanks, and the general conclusion was that both high-explosive and armor-piercing shells fired from the F-34 could penetrate or damage any German tank at a range of 1,000 meters. The combat load for the T-34-76 was 77 rounds for the main gun and 4,725 rounds for the two DT 7.62 mm machine guns. Powering the T-34 was a liquid-cooled aluminum V2 diesel engine developed in the Kharkiv locomotive factory. This engine had 500 horsepower and gave the T-34 a top speed of 53 kilometers an hour. Early production specimens did have deficiencies and problems which were polished in the later stages, but the tank itself had received a rather reliable and good engine. Coupled with the compressed air starting system and lack of return rollers, this proved to be a very good combination, both in the muddy season and later on in the harsh winter conditions. Diesel engines were also less prone to catch fire when the tank was hit, unlike their gasoline counterparts. However, due to the general shortage of V2 engines, some T-34 tanks had to be equipped with Mikulin M17 gasoline engines used on the BT series. The T-34 tank had wide tracks and smaller ground pressure, and weighing in at some 26 tons, it had a good power-to-weight ratio of some 19 horsepower per ton. It had an idler, 5 large diameter road wheels, and a drive sprocket wheel per side, giving it a very distinctive look. When compared to the enemy tanks, the T-34 had a clear advantage in 1941. The German Panzer I and Panzer II tanks were no match for it at all. Having light armor and light weaponry, they stood no chance against the T-34. The Panzer III fared a little better, but its 37mm and 50mm guns were inferior to the T-34's 76.2mm cannon, plus their armor could be penetrated frontally by the T-34 over long distances. The Panzer IV also normally came off worse when confronting the T-34. Its 75mm short cannon was only capable of firing low-velocity, high-explosive shells. The Panzer 35T and Panzer 38T were inferior in every way, especially as they had brittle armor. Mobility was an issue as well. The German tanks were having a difficult time maneuvering through the Russian mud, and later on in the deep snow. Their tracks were narrow, and they were prone to starting difficulties as well as constantly getting stuck. It was clear that the T-34 was a new generation of tank, fully capable of eliminating any type of tank that the enemy could put up against it. However, it did have some shortcomings. Its interior was cramped, especially the turret, and there was no commander's cupola, meaning the commander couldn't achieve good all-around vision and awareness of his surroundings. The fact that the German invasion took place in 1941 meant that numerous problems were arising, such as quality control defects, lack of materials, lack of parts, and problems in organizing mass production. There were numerous innovations and completely new tank parts and systems which were not being thoroughly tested. During these distractions, many defects and problems would appear, and the engineers would face a difficult time of fixing them, optimizing production, and at the same time transferring production to the Urals and the Far East. The birthplace of the T-34, Kharkiv Locomotive Factory, was relocated to the Urals during September and October of 1941 due to the danger of it falling into German hands. Also, a flow of reports was coming in from combat units, complaining about all sorts of deficiencies and problems. Sometimes it was about engine lifespan, sometimes ergonomics, and other times regarding the armor developing cracks. All the reports were taken on board and considered by the engineers and decision-making committees. Coupled with the pre-war ideas of modernizing the tank's base design, this led to the next version and new wave of modifications. From the very beginning of the T-34 production, there had been plans and ideas to modernize the tank. A different gun, engine, better armor, even different suspension were all ideas on the drawing board. The invasion and the start of combat operations had disrupted this and changed priorities. Instead of doing very deep and thorough changes, there were modifications which aimed to simplify production and increase combat value without losing production momentum. That's how the first major improvements and changes were implemented in 1942. In 1942, there was a major shortage of rubber in the USSR. Therefore, all steel road wheels were used for quite some time. It meant more wear and tear on the tracks, noise, and discomfort, but the tanks were being produced and sent to the front. New waffle-pattern tracks were designed but were rarely used on the all-steel road wheels. A major improvement and change was designing the new hexagonal turret. It was previously planned for the T-34M tank, one that would never see the production lines but would provide a good testbed for developing new ideas. The new hexagonal turret started to appear in mid-1942. It provided a bit more space for the crew, improvements in armor protection, and the whole process itself was simplified compared to the original turret. Turrets were made using two techniques, stamping and casting. The cast version was made using a large 45mm plate, pressed into shape using a 5,000-ton press. The stamped versions had two major techniques, using a large number of individually cast components or using three groups, namely walls, the ring, and roof. These differences were noticeable and depended on the factory that was producing the tank. The turret frontal armor increased from 52 to 70 millimeters. Ammo capacity for the main gun increased to 100 shells. Also in 1942, the driver's hatch was changed as well as the turret hatch. Older variants had used a single turret hatch, which, should it get stuck or broken, would prove fatal in some situations when the tank is hit. The new hexagonal turret would use both this old one and the new separate hatches, depending on the availability and the time when the tank was produced. These distinctive new hatches, when both of them were opened, earned it the nickname Mickey Mouse by the Germans, after the Walt Disney cartoon character's ears. The new changes also affected the fuel storage and capacity. The rectangular external fuel tanks were replaced with new cylindrical ones, subsequently increasing the total fuel capacity by up to 150 liters. Some simpler changes were also introduced, like handrails on the turret and the chassis, allowing easier climbing and holding on to the tank. However, 1942 would prove to be a challenging period. The Wehrmacht would start to receive new weapons that were more effective against the T-34. Panzer III would get a longer 50mm barrel. The Panzer IV was upgunned to a longer 75mm gun on the F2 variant, and a new Pak 40 also started to appear. The Germans were also adopting new tank destroyers like the Stug 3 Ausf G and the Marder series. This was in a direct response to the T-34 and KV threat that they were facing, and the battles would stop being so one-sided. With the appearance of a heavy Tiger tank, the Soviet leadership was now fully aware that the T-34 would start losing its edge over its opponents, and something radical needed to be done. The real challenge would be faced during the Battle of Kursk in 1943. The T-34, a World War II armored legend, 1943 to 1945. Clouds of smoke are rising above the steppe. Heavily breathing, sweating, and choking, the German panzer crew are lining up their sights over the silhouettes approaching from the distance. The TZF-5F gun sight is adjusted, just waiting for the command to fire. A Panzergranate 40 armor-piercing projectile has been loaded into the gun breech, ready to fly at over 900 meters per second. The Panzer commander is listening to the radio chatter. Everyone seems to be on edge. There are many silhouettes closing in. Finally, the order is given to fire. The shell flies out, and it takes less than a second to hit the enemy tank. The T-34 is hit, and it stops abruptly, smoking and starting to burn. The tank crew evacuate their disabled vehicle, while dozens of other T-34 tanks are streaming past them. They're all rushing forward, trying to close in and push back the German troops. An entire Guards tank army is attacking down the hill 252.2. Facing them are the elite troops from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Panzer IIIs and IVs, Tigers, Paks, Hummels, Vespes, and their Panzer Grenadiers are dug in and experienced in fighting enemy tanks. The Germans were tired but confident. They have recently thrown out the Soviet defenders from the Oktyabrski farm, and they now occupy favorable positions. In the ensuing fight, one could hardly recognize and distinguish friend from foe. Soviet tanks had driven straight into the German panzer formations, trying to mitigate German armor and tactics. This close combat lasted for hours. Tanks would ram each other, explode, and send turrets flying off. The T-34s would destroy German artillery from point-blank range before being destroyed themselves. Even the Tigers were not immune from such a close range. Several were hit and disabled. To add to the confusion, some T-34s had run into the anti-tank ditch that was dug up by their comrades previously and got stuck. Others were trying to bypass it and became an easy target for the German tanks and anti-tank guns. Chaos and mayhem ensued. The climactic battle would be interrupted by some mid-afternoon heavy rainfall. Hundreds of T-34 tanks were scattered around, partially or completely destroyed or disabled. Losses were high, reminiscent of the 1941 tank battles in the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa. However, the German advance had stalled. Operation Citadel has failed to achieve its goals, and a rapid advance was not possible. The Red Army had yet much to learn. The T-34 tanks had been forced on a narrow corridor between the railway line and the Picel River. The entire tank army had to be echeloned, making them easy targets for the Germans who were ready and waiting for them. The lack of radios, firing on the move, and constant Luftwaffe air attacks were also increasing the death toll. Fortunately, the Soviets had something new being developed, but until it was available, they would have to fight on with everything they could muster up, including the older, out-of-date tanks. Up until 1942, the T-34 tank had been a formidable opponent, but by 1943, the German army had the means and machines to counterattack the threat. The Panzer IV had already received a longer 75mm gun and reinforced armor. The Panzer III in its latest J variant was already using a longer 50mm gun. The Pak 40 had good penetration and ballistic capabilities, being able to knock out T-34 tanks from a fairly good range. The Stug 3 and Marder series were also becoming more and more effective. The Tiger was already well known and had a fearsome reputation. The new vehicles, which made a combat debut at Kursk, like the Ferdinands and Panthers, did have their drawbacks. but they were gaining in experience and reputation and becoming worthy adversaries. The Soviet Union had their T-34 and KV tanks to counter them. By 1943, the T-34 was already a solid tank, with its many deficiencies fixed and problems resolved. The factories were evacuated behind the Urals and in Siberia, and were keeping up with the demand and increasing their output every day. The workers were also getting better and more experienced, so less defects were observed as the time progressed. However, some problems were still present. Above all, the main gun was not as potent as it was in the early stages of the war. Tests conducted in April 1943 showed that the Tiger was nearly invulnerable from the front, except at a very close range. The F-34 gun was simply not capable of dealing with it, and at the same time the Tiger had a devastating effect on the T-34. From a distance of 1.5 kilometers, the Tiger was able to not only penetrate the T-34 frontal armor, but could also shatter the plates and displace the turret. Thus, in May 1943, a decree was issued to develop new tank weapons that were capable of dealing with this threat. There was a gun more potent than the F-34, which had already shown its capabilities. The 52K anti-aircraft gun was used on many occasions as an effective anti-tank weapon. Its 85mm shell had the potency to penetrate more than 100mm of armor at a range of over 1 kilometer. This was sufficient enough to increase the Soviet tank force's chances of inflicting damage to the heavily armored German tanks. Therefore, Soviet designers had used this cannon as a basis to develop a tank version indexed as the D5T. Even before the T-34 tank was armed with an 85mm gun and put into production, another vehicle on the T-34 chassis had received this weapon. A self-propelled gun indexed Su-85 was developed and produced at Uralmash from mid-1943. It would be a stopgap solution until a medium tank with similar firepower could be introduced. Soviet designers were quick to implement it due to the fact that something similar was already achieved a year before. The Su-122 had been developed featuring a 122mm howitzer mounted onto a T-34 chassis. The solution had been quite simple. Start with a T-34 chassis, mount a howitzer on it, and reuse as many components as possible. The quality of the final product and its field performance did show some drawbacks and problems, but in general, the Red Army had received quite a good mobile artillery gun. The 122mm shell was more than capable of seriously damaging even a Tiger tank. It had a low silhouette, potent gun, and generally became a positive and welcome addition for the infantry and as a tank support. Therefore, a similar idea was used for the Su-85, using the same chassis and mounting a new gun. Several variants were proposed, including one with a 107mm gun, but the winner was an Su-85 with the D5T gun. There were a lot of problems with them, such as cracks in the armor, a cramped interior, engine and transmission defects. Their losses were quite high initially though, because they were being used like tanks, but as soon as they started following a couple of 100 meters to the rear, their losses decreased and their kill count increased. So the gun was there, and the chassis was there. However, mounting a gun this big onto the already cramped old turret would be very difficult. A project had already been developed before this, named the T-43. The Soviet leadership had already recognized the threat of the new German weaponry back in 1942. To counter it, a project of a new tank that would bring together the mobility of the T-34 and the armor protection of the KV-1 was developed. It was supposed to protect the tank from the 75mm long-barreled Panzer IV while keeping the same F-34 cannon for the sake of current productivity and production quotas. This compromise was not very successful. Even though the T-43 armor was superior to the T-34's, it was still not sufficient enough to protect it against the 88mm gun, fired from either the Tiger or the flak anti-aircraft gun version. At the same time, it was obvious that the F-34 cannon was incapable of dealing with the latest German tanks, especially after the Kursk battle. However, there was something good in this project that was warmly welcomed by the crews. The new 3-man turret would allow for the installation of a bigger gun and a dedicated commander. Before that, the 2-man turret of the T-34 was not only cramped, but it had put a lot of stress on the commander, being responsible for commanding the tank and acting as a gunner at the same time. Now the crew could be increased to 5, where a tank commander could actually do his job, observing the battlefield, guiding, ordering, and commanding the tank. Thus, the turret was taken from the T-43 project. It wasn't copied, but rather the general shape and ideas were used. It did, however, require expanding the turret ring diameter from 1425mm to 1600mm. Another good change was the placement of the radio. It moved from the hull to the turret, therefore increasing the efficiency and ease of use. The turret armor was increased to 90mm. However, the size and silhouette did increase, while the angle of armor decreased. This would have negative consequences on the armor protection and strength, even creating shell traps, but it was a well-thought-out compromise. The increased armor thickness would compensate for these changes. Now that the tank had the turret, the gun could be selected and installed. The gun chosen was the same as the one on the Su-85, the D5T. It was developed based on the M1939 52K anti-aircraft gun. This cannon had already proven potent and had good penetration capabilities. It could potentially penetrate a Tiger tank's frontal armor from over 1 kilometer. It was not enough, as the Tiger was completely capable of knocking out the T-34 from a distance of up to 2 kilometers. But compared to the F-34 gun, which was totally incapable of knocking out a Tiger from the front, it was a very big leap forward, and it gave the T-34s a fighting chance. This gun wouldn't stay as a definitive choice for long, though. Another gun was chosen as well, the ZIS S-53 gun of the same 85mm caliber, but with a slightly better performance, though the production was a bit delayed until problems with its recoil mechanism were resolved. The ZIS gun is also less complicated to produce. The tank chassis was mostly unchanged from the previous versions. The engine was still the same, the V2 diesel, but the fuel capacity was increased to 810 liters, giving it an operational range of some 360 kilometers. Its weight did increase by 1 ton, from 30.9 to 32 tons, which did result in its top speed being reduced to 52 kilometers per hour. The tank's stability was not really affected by the addition of the new larger turret, as the trials at Kubinka proved. The tank's ammunition capacity for the main gun went down to 55 to 60 rounds, compared to over 100 rounds stored in the T-34-76 model 1943. It might seem like a huge drop, but the 85mm shells were bigger, stronger, and heavier. Each standard shell was some 9.8 kilograms, compared to 6.5 kilograms for the 76mm shells previously used in the F-34. Some 20 rounds were stored in the turret, 16 of them in the ammo rack of the turret bustle, and 4 on the right rear side next to the gunner. The remaining shells were stored in the tank chassis in ammo boxes similar to the previous tank variants. The crew and the shells had no barriers between them, apart from the metal bins in which the rounds were stored, and a rubberized mat above them which potentially created a fire hazard. So the T-34-85 would be ready for action in the first half of 1944, just in time for some major Soviet offense operations. But before that, the Red Army would have to get by with the previous variants. The Kursk battle was a real awakening for the Soviet leadership. Their tank formations had suffered horrendous losses in the course of the battle. Even to this day, historians are arguing about the magnitude of the German and Soviet losses, mostly in tanks and other armored fighting vehicles. At the battle at Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, heavy losses were inflicted on the Soviet armored units, some of which had reported having only 50 tanks left out of 200. The German losses in that respect were much lighter, however. The Red Army could replenish their resources while the Germans had no such option. In addition to all of this, the Soviets had launched Operation Kutuzov in the northern part of the Kursk salient. German troops, already tired and depleted, were just not strong enough to resist this onslaught of Soviet troops, who were taking serious losses but were gaining the initiative, being mobile and numerous, attacking on several points and probing the weak points in German defenses. Eventually, the Germans would fall back to the Hagen Line. With the strategic initiative being taken from them, the Red Army would not lose this advantage on the Eastern Front for the remainder of the war. A bit later, Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev was launched in the southern part of the Kursk salient, a testimony of how long it took the Red Army to replenish and re-equip after the huge losses it sustained in this particular sector during Operation Citadel. Its tank armies were depleted, and there had been too many casualties. However, fresh reserves were now arriving, and heavy battles took place there. Romitsrov's 5th Guards tank army had managed to penetrate the German defenses and take on Bogodukov. It was there that a situation similar to Prokhorovka had occurred, where the German forces were outnumbered by the now reinforced troops of the Soviet 5th Guards tank army. However, the outcome was not the same. Romitsrov's T-34s took a beating and couldn't advance any further, but held the line and exerted heavy pressure upon the Army Group Kempf. The Germans were now threatened with encirclement in Kharkov and were running low on ammo, rations, and manpower, and contrary to Hitler's orders, started to pull out and evacuate. Kharkov was liberated on August 23, 1943, with the German troops fleeing westward through the narrow corridor, bombed and strafed by the Soviet Air Force and pummeled by Soviet artillery. In the following months, the Red Army would push the Germans back to the west, liberate huge parts of the Soviet Union, and fully utilize their big victory at Kursk. The T-34s would travel for many miles, fighting on the move, enduring severe conditions, liberating Kiev and much of the Ukraine, and finally stopping at the Pripyat marshes and the borders of Belarus. This is where some of the units would be reinforced with the new T-34-85 model tank and prepare for the next major Soviet offensive. By late 1943 and early 1944, it was obvious that the previous T-34 models, armed with the F-34 cannon, were no longer superior to the German tanks and weaponry of the same or similar classes. The tank simply needed a bigger gun and heavier armor. The Soviet tactics of tank utilization and organization were getting better with time, but the lack of radios and situational awareness for the tank commanders was taking its toll. German tank doctrine was well tested and battle-proven. It would induce fear and respect in its opponents. The Red Army was still taking huge losses due to the aforementioned factors, combined with bad tactical decisions and a general lack of air support. Already in late 1943 and early 1944, some Guards units were receiving their first small batches of the T-34-85. Tank crews were generally satisfied with the new tank. It was superior in many aspects to the T-34-76 and had left a good impression. In General Katukov's own words, it was a happy event infusing tank crews with optimism, psychologically reinforcing them and showing them that their new tanks were superior to their German counterparts, often praised for their quality by both sides alike. This new tank had performed well against the Panzer IV variants, but still had complications when it was up against the Panther tanks. Even though the Panther's side armor was not a problem for the T-34-85, the frontal armor was very thick, and it still had to get close to be able to penetrate it. On the other hand, the Panther had more options in direct frontal engagements, being able to penetrate the T-34-85's turret and gun mantlet from a greater distance. That advantage wouldn't last long, though. Just in time for the new Soviet summer offensive, the new BR-365P hypervelocity armor-piercing round would appear, giving the T-34-85 the option to combat Panther tanks head-on. Still, the Panther tanks were superior in some respects, coupled with the extensive training that their crews were receiving. However, with the introduction of the T-34-85, engagements had now stopped being so one-sided. By the time Operation Bagration was about to begin, many units had received substantial numbers of the T-34-85s and had the time to familiarize themselves with the new machines. Luckily, most of the tank systems and components were inherited from the previous tank variants, so the tank crews had less trouble getting around and learning new things. The biggest problem was the lack of manpower, lack of trained tank crew personnel, due to the losses sustained in previous years. Some tanks had fewer crew members than they were designated, so instead of 5, some went with 4 or even 3 tank men into the battle. This was gradually resolved by using the tank drivers from the factories and more recruitment, but the impact of losses in the previous years was still very strong. Ironically, what had happened on June 22, 1941 had reversed roles in 1944. The Soviet Army had attacked the German Army Group center in Belarus. A total strategic and tactical surprise was achieved. The Soviet forces had decimated the German defenders and penetrated deep into their lines. After the initial heavy artillery bombardment, the Soviet infantry had managed to penetrate the German lines near Vitebsk. while the massed Soviet tank brigades rushed in, achieving a total strategic breakthrough. The T-34 tanks had shown their full potential concerning mobility and ruggedness, moving through the swampy terrain, and having a good operational range. Soviet troops lacking armored transport such as armored personnel carriers were riding the tanks like they did in the previous years. The so-called Tank of WW2 were taking hard losses in the previous years, but had helped Soviet tank forces in their deep penetrations. Usually they would ride on the tanks until contact was made with the enemy, or their objective was in sight, then jump off and follow the tanks into the assault. This was one of the reasons why the Soviet T-34s had railings, to allow the mounted infantry to easily climb up onto their mounts and hold on tightly as they traveled at full speed. Operation Bagration was a great success for the Red Army, as was another operation that was launched, the Lvov-Sandomir Offensive in July and August 1944. During the later stages of this operation, an interesting event occurred near the Polish village of Ogildau. A single T-34-85 tank commanded by Lieutenant Alexander Oskin from the 53rd Guards Tank Brigade, along with accompanying infantry, had the task of linking up with the elements of the 2nd Battalion in the area of the Ogildau village on August 11, 1944. Upon reaching the village, no friendly tanks were visible, but an approaching German column was noticed, so Oskin reversed back and hid the tank in a cornfield. He informed his superiors about the events and received an order to stay put and observe the enemy. His tank was already hidden in the corn stalks, but the crew and the infantry tank riders had camouflaged the tank turret in the same fashion. But having a single large stack of corn in the middle of the field would look odd, so they constructed several more of them to make it look less obvious. The next day, Oskin spotted some German tanks leaving Ogildau and advancing towards him. Being cool-headed, he had jumped into the tank and ordered his crew to hold fire until the enemy tanks got very close. When the column of 3 King Tigers was some 200 meters away, Oskin ordered his gunner to open fire. A hypervelocity round struck the 2nd tank on the turret side. Oskin was unaware that some of the crew had already been killed, and he now ordered a regular armor-piercing round to be fired, and then another one. They appeared to have no effect on the Tiger, so he ordered another hypervelocity round to be fired, this time to the backside of the tank. Finally, the enemy tank started to burn. The lead tank had started to rotate its massive turret, trying to locate the ambusher. The Oskin crew proceeded to fire 3 rounds at the turret front, all of which just bounced off. However, the 4th round penetrated the turret ring. As a result, the King Tiger started to burn, and there was a massive explosion, and the turret was blown off due to the ammunition igniting inside the tank. The 3rd King Tiger, now engulfed in smoke from the burning 2nd King Tiger, had his vision obstructed and started to back off from the road. Oskin, thinking that the enemy would slip away, activated his own smoke canisters and started the chase. The King Tiger was slow, and he couldn't just run away. Oskin's T-34-85 had approached from the back and fired a round into the enemy tank's rear end, hitting its engine. Now the 3rd King Tiger was knocked out and disabled. When Oskin's tank returned back to the ambush site, the 2nd King Tiger had stopped burning, so his crew fired another round of hypervelocity ammunition into it and put an end to the tank. 3 King Tigers were now wrecked, with 0 Soviet casualties. Oskin had shown great tactical knowledge, cool-headedness, and nerve. His ambush not only stopped the German armored column, but it was exactly here that the King Tigers had made their debut on the Eastern Front. The result of this and of consecutive battles proved disastrous for the Germans. As time passed, the T-34-85 would come up against practically all the different types of enemy tank. Engagements with the Panzer IVs would usually end as a T-34-85 victory, but fighting against heavier German tanks was not always so predictable. German panzer units still had the tactical advantage in training and equipment quality, though they were increasingly running low on manpower, fuel, repairs, and air support. On the other hand, the Soviets and the Allies were constantly getting stronger and more experienced. The T-34-85, along with the other tanks, would face a new enemy in the later stages of the war, a handheld anti-tank weapon called the Panzerfaust, which could exert a deadly toll on the T-34-85s in urban combat. Many vehicles fell prey to this weapon, which was manufactured in huge numbers. It was easy to operate and gave the average infantryman the option to knock out tanks from short and medium ranges. The Panzerfaust was capable of destroying the T-34-85 from any angle. The Volkssturm, Germany's last line of defense, were inadequate in a sustained firefight due to their advanced ages and inexperience, but were still capable of knocking out Soviet tanks with these weapons. Upon entering Berlin and other German towns, the Soviet tankmen had developed two new tactics. One tactic was grouping tanks and infantry together, trying to cover street angles, and as soon as a stronghold was reached, the tanks would pull back to a safe distance, behind the range of the Panzerfaust. The other tactics would include welding metal meshes onto the turret and tank body, hoping that it will prematurely detonate the Panzerfaust warhead. Soviet tank crews would do anything to increase their chances of survival. The T-34-85 would fight until the end of the war in Europe, and when that was over it would continue fighting in the Far East against the Japanese, who were already weakened and generally lacked decent armored units, and were decimated under the Soviet army onslaught. They had no tanks that could match the Soviet ones. Interestingly enough, the frontline formations would include the T-26, BT-7, T-34s of all types, and the T-34-85 tanks, all working together. The troops fighting in the Far East would not dispose of their armored vehicles for the whole period of the war, so they had some which were woefully outdated by that time. In the second half of 1944, the Red Army would receive another potent vehicle made on the T-34 chassis. The Su-100 was a logical step forward from the Su-85. Its 100mm main gun was strong enough to pose a serious threat to any German tank or self-propelled gun that it might encounter. Combined with stronger frontal armor, which was the equivalent to 125mm, the Su-100 was well liked by the crews and could successfully carry out the numerous tasks required of it. The D-10 gun mounted on it was so powerful that even the post-war tanks continued to use it, like the versions of the T-54 and T-55. A major drawback of the Su-100 was the quality of its optics, but in general, this self-propelled gun was a true success. During the war, the Soviet Red Army would utilize flamethrower tanks. It was not a new concept, though, as the older T-26 tanks had also been converted into flame-throwing vehicles. As for the T-34, all models had a variant with this feature. The OT-34 would be first in line, featuring an ATO-41 flamethrower instead of a hull machine gun. It could fire a burst of flame 90 meters and had a fuel tank capacity of 105 liters. Which would allow some 10 bursts of flame. Due to the carnage and chaos encountered during the summer of 1941, the Red Army would not receive him until 1942. Later on, the variant ATO-42 was introduced, increasing the range to 130 meters and an even larger fuel capacity. It would be replaced with the ATO-43, increasing the range even further and also reduce the weight and complexity of the system. The T-34-85 would also have a version designated as the OT-34-85. Some 1,500 flamethrower tanks of all variants were made. The Germans would use any piece of equipment that they could get their hands on. The T-34 was no exception. Early captured variants were designated Panzerkampfwagen T-34-747R. The Germans would paint large crosses and swastikas all over it in order to make it look clear to the other panzer crews and the Luftwaffe that this tank was one of their own. Barbarossa was a good example for reusing captured tanks. Many had just broken down or simply run out of fuel. The Germans would repair them if possible, rearm them, and put their new crews in them. However, using these tanks was not an easy feat. Taking into account that all the production facilities were in Soviet hands, apart from the Kharkov plant, which had been stripped of all its equipment, it was not easy to keep these tanks in running order. Some were simply used until they completely broke down, and some were salvaged for spare parts. Some captured T-34s had received German equipment and modifications. One common thing to add was the no-tech blackout tail light. This made it possible to check the distance of the vehicle in front if you were in a convoy, especially in blackout or total darkness conditions. Some had extra Schusen armored skirts. One of the frequent additions was a commander's cupola, taken from the Panzer III or Panzer IV. In general, though, the Germans were not very impressed with the captured tanks. They were damaged, worn out, cramped, and lacking suitable equipment. The Kharkov factory, now in German hands, was conducting some repairs under the supervision of the SS, but even that didn't last very long. But later, captured T-34s were repaired in a tank repair facility at Königsberg. Interestingly enough, though, the captured T-34 tanks were fighting practically until the end of World War II in Europe. One of the most interesting conversions was a Flakpanzer T-34. A T-34 tank chassis was taken, stripped of its turret, and fitted with a new one, housing the Flakvieling 4x22mm anti-aircraft cannon. Surrounded by angled metal plates at the front and sides, the Germans had created a mobile anti-aircraft vehicle. The last known example of this vehicle existed before Operation Bagration, where it was probably destroyed. The T-34 tank production had started in January 1940 and would last for many years to come, the last model being produced in Czechoslovakia in 1958 as the T-34-85 variant. In this period, some 84,070 vehicles were produced, 35,120 of the T-34-76, and the rest, 48,950, being the T-34-85. A truly astonishing figure, taking into account all the hardships and problems that the Soviet Union was facing following the German invasion. It was superseded only by the T-55, the latter being the most produced tank in history. But still, Soviet factories had produced some 58,700 T-34s during the war, more than the entire German tank production, which peaked at 46,000 armored fighting vehicles. If we add other tank types like the T-26, BT-7, T-28, and KV series, then the Soviet armored fighting vehicle production rose to 107,000 vehicles. It was clear that the Soviet tank production not only caught up with the German one, but surpassed it twofold. Production numbers themselves were not sufficient to win the war. German tank war doctrine concentrated on quality over quantity, on technical superiority over production figures. Nazi Germany had fewer resources, be that production capabilities or fuel and manpower, but they concentrated on building a smaller but more elite and capable force. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had more resources. Their war strategy dictated huge and massive armies and breakthroughs into the enemy rear, a so-called deep battle. The Red Army was named the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, a name that had its roots in the formation of the force during the Russian Civil War. Thus, the Soviet technology was generally designed to perform in the harshest of conditions, but require less skill from its operators. Combined with the purges of the officer corps just before World War II, a sudden and disastrous German invasion and its consequences, the incompetence and misconduct among some of the senior Red Army officers, the losses in the Soviet tank force were enormous. Already in 1941, some 20,000 tanks had been lost. Most of these were the old tank types, but even with the new ones, losses were mounting. 15,000 in 1942, 22,400 in 1943, 16,900 in 1944. Only in 1945 did the Soviet losses compare to the German ones, being some 8,700. Around 44,900 T-34 tanks were lost in World War II, out of 58,700 produced, the highest loss ratio ever recorded. Therefore, the T-34 crews paid a heavy price for their victory in World War II. The tank had an excellent combination of so-called hard factors, armor, firepower, and mobility. This would give it a big advantage over the German tanks. However, the so-called soft factors were not satisfactory, and some were terrible: the ergonomics, vision, crew composition, and layout. The T-34 was a cramped, crude, and hard-finished tank. The crew had such bad visibility that in some cases drivers had to navigate their tanks into battle with their hatch partially open. Another problem was the crew composition. The absence of a dedicated commander, or so-called two-man turret in the early versions, meant that the commander could not concentrate on fighting and directing his crew, but instead he had to do multiple tasks. Only when this issue was addressed with the T-34-85 was there a positive impact on the combat losses and tank performance. Throughout the years, discussions and analysis were, and still are, raging whether the T-34 was the best tank of the war or was it better than this or that tank. The facts are that in single frontal engagements, the T-34 had a fighting edge in 1941 and also partially in 1942. Later on, it had lost its advantage due to the advancement in design of the enemy tanks. In the later stages of the war, the T-34 would start to increase its effectiveness again. However, taking only crude data into the analysis, one can get a bad and inaccurate picture. The fact is that the T-34 had done its bit to help win the war, just like the Sherman tank. It was a good design with some flaws, but the one that would fit the Soviet war doctrine and weather, as well as the environment. Thus, the T-34 had earned the right to be called a tank of victory. As a matter of fact, the war would continue for the T-34. The last conflict where the T-34-85 would be seen taking part was the Yemen Civil War, as recent as 2019, alongside the Su-100. It is a true testimony of how solid and durable these tanks were.